Thank you very much, and it's a delight to be here on this important topic at this important conference. One of the things that's not mentioned in my biography that I should mention straight away is that I'm also the chair of Blueprint for Better Business, which is the charity that Sue and others helped found and where she's still a trustee. So one of the challenges of this panel, I think, is going to be for us to get a little bit of grit into the oyster about this topic. Vital as it is, lest we all agree violently about the objectives. We're hoping to also concentrate in this panel on the how to achieve some of these objectives, the operational need to kind of change something in what companies and businesses are doing, and not just to hear wise, lofty words about objectives, of which, as you'll be aware, there are plenty around. And to help me do that, we've got a great lineup. Sue, as I've mentioned, who until last year was at Unilever down the road here, or up the river here, working on embedding their sustainable living plan into the business, so with lots of operational knowledge. Neil Carberry from the Recruitment and Employment Confederation and previously Managing Director at the CBI, and Colin Mayer, whose book Prosperity, I think it's fair to say, has helped to sort of shape some of this debate over the last year or so, and who is also working and about to reveal the findings of the Future of the Corporation research that is being announced tomorrow, although he's already said he's not going to give us any hints about what the future of the corporation is likely to be, according to that research. But I'm going to ask Colin to start off and set the scene for us with 9 or 10 minutes of overview, and then I'll come to Neil and Sue for a discussion. And we're going to come to you in the audience as soon as we can, really, because I know that there'll be lots of intense interest in the how of this question, and I don't want to leave you shortchanged. We're running a little bit late, but we're going to get a full session in and wind up around 11:45 to give you time to go to the next parallel sessions. So start thinking now about your concise questions and comments on the panel. So, Colin, over to you.
Andrew, thank you very much, and I think I'll stand up. Business has been a tremendous force for promoting growth and prosperity, but there's increasing question about the inclusiveness of that growth and prosperity for either people or planet. Over the last few months, there's been a dramatic shift in terms of public statements on this subject, starting with Larry Fink in the beginning of the year, then with the Business Roundtable in August, then with the Financial Times launching its new agenda, Capitalism, Time for a Reset, and last week we had the Institute of Directors coming out with their corporate governance manifesto. And all of that has been around the question of why does business exist, what is it there to do, why is it created, what does it aspire to become? In other words, its purpose. And there is an increasing view that's gaining traction that everything should follow from that in terms of business policy, practice, and education. The question isn't so much now why or whether, but more a question of how and what. And let me just start off with that question about what. What does it actually mean to talk about purpose? There's a growing acceptance that it's not simply about making profits, money for companies and investors. It's something more than that, but what precisely is a cause of considerable confusion. The way in which I suggest that one needs to think about it is in terms of business solving problems. Business there to create profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for people or planet. And the notion of that being a source of the purpose of business then does give rise to a notion of inclusivity, because it starts off by saying, well, you certainly shouldn't be profiting from creating harm from others, and it's saying that you should be looking to essentially try and solve problems that we as employees, as customers, as societies, etc., face. And that then suggests that the purpose of a business is much more than just being a description of what it does, of producing washing machines or cars, but it's also not just purely aspirational in terms of saying we're here to save the world. It's saying what problems are business precisely trying to solve, how are they solving it, over what period are they solving it, and why are they the best suited businesses for doing that. And I just really want to quickly illustrate this in relation to an example of a business that went through this procedure. It's of the Danish pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk, which produces insulin that's used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. And a few years ago, it realized that it was failing to serve the main markets in the world where type 2 diabetes prevails. 85% of type 2 diabetes is found in low and middle income countries, many of which could not afford to purchase its insulin. So it then thought about, well, our purpose must be more than just to produce insulin. And it argued that its purpose was really to help people treat type 2 diabetes. So it started working with doctors and medical practitioners and universities around the world to identify the best way of treating type 2 diabetes in different parts of the world. And then it recognized, well, actually, it's more than that as well. It's not just to treat people who had type 2 diabetes, but to help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes at all. So it then started working with local communities, with health workers, with national governments to identify the changes in lifestyles that could help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes at all. And its purpose is now stated to be to eradicate type 2 diabetes around the world. Now, you might say, well, that's all very well. It sounds very noble and worthy, but surely it undermined the basic business model of Novo Nordisk. And the answer is it did exactly the opposite. It's been a source of great growth and success of the company. Why? Because in the process of building up those relationships and demonstrating that it was really sincere about trying to solve those problems, it became a trusted supplier, trusted with those medical practitioners, professionals, governments and local communities around the world. Now that, I think, illustrates 2 points that I want to emphasize, and that is if it really is going to be inclusive, purpose needs to be very carefully defined as to what precisely one is purposeful about. And the second point is to emphasize that if companies are really committed then to the delivery on this, then it's not only beneficial to you and I as customers and communities and the environment, etc., but it's highly beneficial for companies themselves because it builds up that element of trust, which then gives rise to greater loyalty amongst customers, more engaged employees, more supportive societies, etc. So the question is, how can companies provide that real authenticity, that these are not just bland statements about what they would aspire to do, but things that they are actually going to put into practice? Now, there are a number that I could mention, but I just very briefly want to touch on 3 or 4. The first is around ownership, because there is a repeated view, correctly stated, that even if boards of companies are committed to doing this, it's actually quite difficult if they're dependent on investors who don't have that same degree of commitment to the delivery of those purposes. It's given rise to a greater emphasis in policy in terms of the stewardship role of institutions alongside their role in supporting their beneficiaries to steward the companies in which they're investing. But I think it takes more than that. It takes a real element of commitment in terms of owners who are identifiable, not just anonymous, very dispersed institutional investors who can stand behind those purposes that companies have. And in that regard, I just point out that the ownership structure of Novo Nordisk is one by which it is actively traded on the Danish stock market. It has a lot of institutional investors, but it has a dominant shareholder, which is the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which has 25% of the cash flow rights and 75% of the votes in Novo Nordisk. And that element of stability has been extremely important in the capacity of the company to really promote that purpose that it's put forward. The second element that I'd like to emphasize is in terms of the governance of companies. And in this regard, there has been a lot of advance in this country in terms of the statement of corporate governance, the Corporate Governance Code, which has moved away from the notion that corporate governance is just about aligning the interests of management with their shareholders, to the notion that corporate governance should be about companies stating their purposes and then demonstrating how their boards, their cultures, their strategies, their values, etc., are aligned with the delivery of that. Now that's an advance, but there's also an element of accountability that's important here. To whom ultimately is the board accountable? Who's accountable for the appointment and replacement of boards of directors, etc. And in that regard, it's again interesting to see that there's a growing interest in the notion of employees, in particular through the forms of employee trusts, of which John Lewis is the best and most cited example. But there are others such as Arup, the consulting engineering company, and Richer Sounds is much quoted in the case of Julian Richer. All of those are examples of not just employee ownership, but of employee trusts. And the importance of the distinction is that a trust is something that's concerned with the intergenerational well-being of employees, not just in the current generation of employees. The final thing that I just like to briefly touch upon is in terms of measurement, because it is critical that if one is going to promote purpose in companies, that they are measured by their delivery of those purposes. And in that respect, the recent publication that has come out from the CPP on a good life, the role of employers, is very significant, because it's attempting to establish to what extent is there evidence that large employers in the UK are good employers. And it's got 7 sets of metrics around which it's attempting to measure that in terms of pay, conditions, terms of employment, the extent to which they provide a good work-life balance, the training of employees, the diversity, and the degree of voice and representation that employees have. And those 7 components form the basis of an index that they then used for trying to rank the extent to which different large employers, and they've looked at the 25 largest employees accounting for some 2.3 million employees in the UK, to what extent do they look to be good employees. And basically the message that comes out of it is that in some respects it appears to be surprisingly poor, insofar as only 4 out of the 25 are certified as paying a living wage, and that the extent to which one observes differences across the 25 companies is in part related to whether or not they're publicly owned or privately owned. There are some elements that are related to their sectors, but there's a lot that is not accounted for by either public, private, or sector, and which seems to be specific to a company. And that then comes down to the extent to which companies are really committed to this. They have the leadership at the top that helps them to deliver on being good employees. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Just a small additional point, micro point about measurement and inclusiveness. I was told recently that in the United States, the body that measures the best places to work changed its methodology to make it more inclusive and to start measuring the happiness of employees across a whole diverse range. And it changed the ranking quite dramatically. They found that being a good place to work, if you're all one type of person, changes when you start to measure the people who feel excluded in the community.
It's a bit like the Harvard Business Review when it changed its ranking of leaders, the best leaders in the world, to include some element of sustainability. It virtually reversed the ordering.
Yes, I think it drove Amazon down from 1 to 86, and this year right off the ranking altogether of the top 100. Neil, let me turn to you and give your perspective on this. You've obviously been dealing over many years with big businesses grappling with these things in the field, as it were. What are you learning and about how companies can do good.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Colin, for what I thought was a really good introduction to this topic. And I've been really pleased to be involved with the work of the CPP on this over the last year, bringing to bear both what I've learned at the CBI, but for the last few years I've sat on the Low Pay Commission, so I've spent a lot of time talking to workers who do feel excluded from what we do and say. Probably three things that are important to me in this debate. The first one is kind of addressing how we conceptualize the interrelationship of business and society, because that's the way for a long time we've thought about it. There is society and there is business. There's our cultural life and inclusion and diversity, and then there's how we make the money. And in many ways, that is at the heart of the problem. Business exists to serve society. Business exists on a license to operate from society, and it has a license to operate because of some things which many business leaders are surprised to be having to talk about now. You know, the benefit of free markets to prosperity is a major issue in the current general election campaign. Now, personally, I don't think it should be, because it's fairly well attested globally. If you look at our performance on all sorts of global welfare indices, that capitalism responsibly followed is the best way of lifting prosperity for the whole of global society, responsibly followed. But that almost othering the business debate and the economic debate from the social debate has given rise to quite a lot of suspicion of the business community in parts of the debate, and at the same time, I don't think I'll surprise any of you by saying that the British business community right now doesn't feel like it's being listened to. What is the lesson of the last decade? That the business voice has not had much impact in our national political life. So resolving that is really important, and some of it is about businesses re-engaging with their place in society and making their arguments differently, and absolutely getting better at telling stories about the good they do. Last Wednesday at the REC, we launched a series of videos from agency workers who were telling stories about why they work as agency workers, and guess what? Unlike the stories that some politicians will tell you, the vast majority of people who work as agency workers through My Members enjoy it, and they're doing great things with their lives. But that kind of grey area of how do we assess what is good and what is bad requires a cooperative approach and a new set of thinking from business, but also from public policymakers. So a push factor and a pull factor. The pull factor is the best things we have ever done to address inclusion in our economy have been done cooperatively between businesses, governments, and the third sector. If you think about the introduction of the minimum wage, if you think about the introduction of automatic enrolment into pensions, there is a stewardship in public policy and public thought that requires businesses to come along into the big tent and then to accept things that are good for society, even if they might not themselves have advocated it. The classic example of this is the number of civil servants who tell me that my personal, and I think it is personal, opposition to the current structure of the apprenticeship levy, for instance, is about being worried about the levy as a tax. Well, I was critically involved in the CBI over 10 years in the introduction of automatic enrolment into pensions, which costs 6 times as much as the apprenticeship levy. But there is no campaign from British business to address that because the policy works. The risk if we don't pitch these big tents that bring businesses in is that we make policy that doesn't work. And the apprenticeship levy doesn't work. So that space for debate is really important. The second bit then is the push factor, which is what should businesses be pushed to do? And I think the report from the CPP identifies some key metrics that are important to look at and measure over time. My observation would be that we need to park CSR at the door. This is not about the story you tell. This is about what you do. And I think in lots of areas of our society at the moment, we are cursed with lots of followership at the top and not leadership. And there are lots of good stories about what we're doing. If you talk to my members, 3,300 recruiters, they think it's great that the British boardroom cares about diversity now. They still won't pay a penny more to a recruiter to have a diverse shortlist, on average, because that requires work, and it's work that in the permafrost of British companies, people are not yet seeing as important. The only way that changes is when chief executives do what Antonio Horta-Osorio at Lloyds did, throw things back if they're not in line with sustainability goals. That is a big leadership test for the top of British business, and it will require confidence and an ability to bring the investor community along for the ride. I have lost count of the number of chief executives who have said to me that the reason they moved into privately held companies was they wanted to do something that lasts and not just be a PR guy for the company to investors. So and this is a big London versus the rest of the country challenge, because the majority of British businesses aren't in this city. The majority of British businesses aren't listed on the London Stock Exchange. But if you look at the way the investor community has started to talk about this, some very positive strands there about long-term sustainability, that has to follow through. Leadership has to be supported where it exists. I'm not sure we're there yet.
Neil, I haven't quite seen where you're drawing the line here between regulation, which you haven't mentioned as specifically, and the sort of self-regulation, which I think tends to lead people to feel cynically that companies are just marking their own homework. I mean, it goes slightly to Colin's point about having sound measurement, because then you can start to compare people. But where do you think the line should be drawn on the regulator, the power of the regulator and politician in this?
Well, this is a really interesting debate, and the living wage and the national minimum wage is a classic example of this. The regulatory floor should be the things that society finds unacceptable. Beyond that, we need to find ways of moving expectations for companies in a cooperative way, and that identifies what is and isn't acceptable. I think about this a lot right now, because next April the government's committed to introducing changes to tax for contractors. There is, for my members, a low road way of doing that and a high road way of doing that. For us as an organisation, and I think I had a very good discussion with Matthew Taylor about this recently, who's just taken over as Director of Labour Market Enforcement, I think there is a big, big role, and I don't say this with self-interest, although I have self-interest in it, for balanced leadership and collaboration between business bodies to articulate and strengthen that self-regulation. So the REC, we're one of the only trade associations that requires our members to pass a compliance test. I threw 40 members out of the REC last year. It's not good for my figures, but it's the right thing to do. And I think a bit of that long-term stewardship from business bodies is going to be important to addressing some of that cynicism about self-regulation.
Okay, well, we may come back to that. Sue, you've had years at the coalface trying to embed this new way of thinking. I think we probably agree that CSR, with all due respect to people who have CSR on their business cards, is seen as a way of sort of boxing away the social responsibility part into a separate department. You've spent a long time at Unilever making sure that is woven into the business. Tell us a bit about your perspective on this.
So I thought, and I'm really sorry because I can only see about half of you. So I hope what I say is interesting enough for you to keep listening, although you can't actually see me. In fact, I just want to start with a really quick dipstick. If you agree that most CEOs, think about the full range of business, are fundamentally good people, could you stick your hand up? Okay, that's quite an interesting experiment in itself. So the reason I asked you that is because in the very privileged vantage point that I have had, working at the senior levels of Unilever for nearly a decade, And then before that, working at a senior level in government, I've come across I don't know how many CEOs. And I can honestly tell you that most of them did not claw their way up their organisations to get to be boss in order to do simply two things, i.e. to keep just the right side of the regulations and to deliver short-term profits to shareholders. None of them. But that's what a lot of them do, right? So, I think you have to start with, if you believe that the human condition is fundamentally good, which I do, and my experience bears that out, and I see that a lot of you in the room don't agree with that, and I suspect the reason you don't is because you judge them by their behaviours, which is completely fair enough. And so how do you end up with this dichotomy where, on the one hand, most people I think are fundamentally good, including CEOs, because they're people as well, and yet, business has behaved, not talked its way into this situation where there is a fundamental breakdown in the trust of society because of very real things, and we've talked about some of the totemic things today. In the interest of time, I won't go through a list. And actually, I just want to tell you in 2 minutes flat a very simple story that for me absolutely crystallises the dilemma that I've just articulated to you. And it all really comes down to shareholder primacy. So we've had mention of this, but the chronic, constant pressure for any listed company to deliver for the short term or potentially be broken up is dramatic, it's inescapable, and it's all-consuming for those leaders. And so I just wanted 2 minutes to tell you what it was like living through the Kraft Heinz bid, which was 2 years ago. And the CEO at the time, Paul Polman, called it a near-death experience for Unilever. And I can tell you that is no exaggeration. So we had a hostile bid put on us as a company by a company whose business model could not have been more different. And everything I'm going to tell you is already on the record, so for any of you scribbling furiously, I'm not giving you a news break, although I might give you another interesting tidbit you might want to repeat. But the CFO publicly described their business model as close to a Ponzi scheme. So what Kraft Heinz does is it acquires, and it does that through layering more and more debt into the balance sheet, their own and that of the company they're acquiring. They invest very little in the top line, i.e. what drives real growth. They take a huge amount of that money down to the bottom line, i.e. what rewards shareholders in the short term. They see a gradual decline in sales over the period of 2 to 3 years on average. And you can look at all the data, and there was a rash of articles about this very recently. And then they start all over again. And what the very courageous leadership at Unilever had tried to do was to both manage the tensions of the appetites of short-term shareholders to deliver consensus quarter after quarter and to do things like drive the living wage, etc., etc. In fact, it went much further than that in looking at policies around how we could help address issues of inequality way upstream in the supply chain. So it was very ambitious. And we basically faced a period that lasted in reality for well over 3 months, where there was a serious prospect that the Kraft Heinz business model would win over the Unilever business model. And in order to prevent that, we saw a 35% increase in the share and price as soon as that bid became known. It then plummeted immediately after that because the shareholders said, oh, well, we were happy a week ago, but now we'd like more value, please. And so the management of the company then has to think about how it can generate more value whilst not throwing away the baby with the bathwater. And it has managed to do that and to tread a very, very fine path. But we were told by our investment team, banking team and lawyers that 95% of all hostile takeovers are successful unless they're repelled within a week of the bid being made. Why? Because you get a ratchet effect where the intervening company simply offers so much that the board can't in all conscience repel that bid. So we were a week away from having somebody that really didn't care about how we were trying to do business well take the business over. But what was even worse is that once we'd repelled that bid, We then had lots of other businesses circling in the form of activist shareholders who made it very plain that very quickly they would be looking at trying to take a stake and break up the company because they believed that they could generate much more of a short-term release for shareholders. And when we looked to the legislation, it didn't defend us. And I don't want us to get into an academic debate today about what the real intent is behind Section 172. You only have to ask any corporate lawyer, is there any case history ever about a company using that to defend trying to do business for the long term in a way they think is best for the interest of the company? None. So I go back to my original point. I think most CEOs are good people. I think they're operating in an unbelievable vice-like grip of how the markets operate at the moment and the level of expectation. I think the people at the bottom of the pile always come out worst because that's how life works and it's not at all fair. But I think if you could change one single thing that isn't interventionist, that would be what I would change.
Thank you, Sue. I'll just briefly go back to Colin on that specific point about Unilever. I mean, from where Unilever starts, could it be anything other than a dispersed shareholder company open to another bid 3 years down the line? I mean, there isn't a way of transitioning Unilever to any of the models that you've proposed, is there?
Well, it tried to do it in part by shifting its headquarters from London to the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And it was prevented it from doing it by the institutional investors. Why were they concerned? Well, they put out various stories about it shifting off being listed on the FTSE, but actually the main reason why they were concerned about it was it would have much greater takeover defences were it based in the Netherlands rather than in the UK. And as a consequence of that, they would have lost the share premium associated with it. Now that illustrates precisely the nature of the problem. And Sue's absolutely right that we have a system that coherently is built around this notion that institutional investors dominate the way in which corporate decisions are taken. And what we need to do is essentially to think about, well, how do we reform it from its coherent focus on shareholder interests to something that is focused on the sorts of purposes that I was just talking about? And there's no question in my mind that ultimately it's going to come down to a change in law. Because the law defines what a corporation is. And Sue put it extremely well. Now, people say, there isn't a problem with the law. You know, you can basically do whatever you like under Section 172. And that's exactly the problem. You can do whatever you like, but you get no protection from the law if you decide to pursue something that is other than shareholder value maximizing. And that's what basically other forms of ownership have been very successful at doing. I'll come back to the Novo Nordisk example. As I said, it's listed on the Danish stock market. It's actively traded. If you want to, you can buy and sell shares as much as you like in the company. But it has an anchor shareholder that is concerned about the long term of the company. Britain, as Paul Miners once said, is an ownerless economy. It has no real owners. And that's a fundamental problem.
Can I just add something to that, Andrew?
Yeah.
Because I think it's really important that we acknowledge that no change is accepting a change that has happened progressively over the last few decades. It is still common. People still say to me that shareholders are pension funds. Largely, that is not the case in the way it was. So, say if you go back into the 70s or the early 80s and you had large defined benefit pension schemes as substantive equity holders in UK business, that actually mitigated some of this challenge because, speak as a former defined benefit scheme trustee, as a trustee, I'm not interested in what you're going to generate for me in 3 months' time. I'm interested in the income stream that you're going to deliver to me for 20 years for liabilities that I'll be paying in 50 years' time. The loss of that group of institutional investors from UK equity is underreported and is a driver of everything Colin just said.
I just want to bring Sue back in on one thought. You talked about the employees losing out. I mean, there's always the person at the end. I
Yeah.
often think of them as being at the kind of end of the whip. The market cracks the whip, and they're suddenly the ones who are frayed off at the end. What's the sense that you get from Unilever and also from looking at other companies that employee power, if you like, is improving and that they are finding ways to force, if you like, the inclusivity of business in this way?
Well, I think the most powerful thing that people are doing that they didn't used to do is voting with their feet. So, you know, and there's lots of data on this, but there's also lots of stories I could tell from the wide range of businesses that I see now, where young people simply either won't join a company or won't stay if they see behaviours that they find really dissonant. And I think ultimately that kind of, you know, there's a great book called New Power, and it's well worth a read if anybody hasn't had a look at it. And the principles in it are, I think, are absolutely, we're seeing it lived out now. And I think the fundamental shift, particularly amongst young people now, is dramatic. I think your power once you're in a company to drive change from within is very marginal. And the reality is, you know, when I look now at the sorts of companies that I'm working with, all major multinationals, there's one thing in common that they've all got, which is that people feel increasingly like they're almost working in a sweatshop. And the problem is that when you're in it, and once you reach a certain level and you've got family dependency and so on, you feel like a prisoner. You actually feel more like a prisoner than you really are, but, you know, perception is reality thing. And I think things like, for example, what Capita are doing, having an employee on a board, is a great experiment, but it's very courageous. And I see very little appetite now to formalise an employee role on boards, which is a real shame. And the reality is that kind of change is going to happen very incrementally and slowly.
Interestingly, whenever I write about loyalty, corporate schemes to keep people loyal, I get a barrage of reader comments and emails from people saying, why should I as an employee be loyal to my employer when they're not loyal to me? Look at the layoffs and so on. I think that's a great sort of chasm of trust that's opened up over the last decades.
Andrew, there's a really important point here, because the one thing I'd take issue with what Sue said is, I just think our younger generation are much more mouthy than any of us were willing or brave enough to be, because I see that frustration through the whole of the workforce. And I think if there's a part of our businesses that has failed, it is the slavish commitment to this US-generated human resources management approach that if you get the employee value proposition right down from the top and everyone sings the company song, people will in some way internalize the values of the company and productivity will be boosted. And you can still see it in our public policy debate. Look at the industrial strategy. It's all about skills. Skills matter, but to talk only about skills is to treat the workforce as automatons. Thomas Premuzic, the book The Talent Delusion, is really powerful. And I say this as an old industrial relations guy, and you never really escape it once you've been in it. It's about psychology and motivation. Productivity in Britain will come from motivated workers with the skills to do the job well. And it's about, I agree that employee voices at senior levels in business are really powerful. It's actually about British employers learning to behave like employers again and say, these are the things we need to achieve, and we acknowledge where you are coming from and the things you need to achieve, and finding ways to manage the natural conflict of that. You cannot remove conflict from the workplace. What you can do is accept it's there and manage it well.
Okay, I'm going to open out to the audience. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for as many questions as we can fit in. I'm going to try and pay attention. You may be sitting out on the left or right wings here because you don't want to be called on, but if you do, please indicate. I'll keep an eye out for you. But we'll start in the middle since people have their hands up in the middle. At the front here, this gentleman.
Nick Howard from the Workers' Educational Association, taking the centre ground here. Fascinating discussion, and I do wonder whether, and I'd be interested to hear the reaction when I say this, is as to whether business can learn from the third sector in this debate, because of the fact that most charities, organisations in the third sector have a social purpose, and they are able to command a huge amount of loyalty and engagement from their staff. And it struck me that from what you were saying about that idea of a purpose, it's clearly defined within the organisation I work with. It's education for a social purpose, and that provides and that makes it very clear in terms of the values of the organisation. So part of my job is to look at how we can align values with business to find common areas in which we can support each other in the work that we do. So I sometimes find it difficult to find that common ground with some companies, and so I'd be interested to know your comments as to whether you would agree that there is some opportunity for the third sector to support the corporate sector in terms of this issue around a value-driven social purpose.
Okay, I'll take a bunch of questions actually from the middle here, and then the lady here on this flank. We'll come to them in a group.
It's Sundus Tevfik from Bloom's Nano. It's a social enterprise. My question is to Neil. Could you please explain why apprenticeship levy does not work, in your opinion? Mm-hmm. Because in my experience, worked in quite a long time in relating to pharmaceuticals and food, companies do not want to employ people who do not have experiences. So they would actually steal from smaller companies. So the people would go and train in smaller companies, and bigger companies would take them on board by giving them a little bit more money, mm-hmm. and they don't have to train them. So why the apprentice levy would not work for bigger companies?
Okay, thank you. And then the gentleman here at the back.
Thank you. Tom Levitt. I'm the author of a book called The Company Citizen. I think it's quite right to revisit the Companies Act. It is 13 years old now, but I do think that legislation follows good practice rather than leads it, and it's therefore necessary for those who are doing the right thing to be able to be making the case that the right thing actually works from a business perspective. And in that sense, I'd like to ask Sue about something else that happened in Unilever at about the time we're talking about, or just before, and that is that you scrapped quarterly reporting. And you were told by some people at the time that you couldn't do it, but you went ahead and did it anyway. I understand that some of the hedge funds, the most short-term of investors, then walked away. But what have been the benefits to Unilever from scrapping quarterly reporting?
Thanks. Well, we'll take those three roughly in that order. Neil, you mentioned the third sector in your remarks. What do you think can be learnt from the third, and indeed from social enterprise? Sometimes I hear people saying social enterprise has things to teach business about.
I think that's absolutely true. So two things I think about the third sector's relationship that I've learned in working over many years with third sector organisations. One is I have rarely met chief executives more fiercely commercial in the private sector than those I meet in the third sector. So the idea that purpose and business and commerciality don't go hand in hand is amply demonstrated to be false by the third sector, and I think that is a powerful lesson and a big lesson the third sector can bring to business. On the flip side of that, there have been a number of, shall we say, challenges in the third sector over the last couple of years, which I think again goes to show that governance models will only take you so far. It is about what you do when nobody's watching that really matters, and it's about behaviours. And as I have the floor, can I pick up the apprenticeship levy point?
Yes, just briefly. Maybe you want to take it offline as well.
We will do. I think apprenticeships are powerful, and one of the reasons I don't like the apprenticeship levy is I like apprenticeships. And for levy-paying businesses, the apprenticeship levy puts up the cost of each additional apprenticeship. And in my world, if you want a lot of apprenticeships, that's a bad thing to do. And I take no pleasure in saying this, but the paper we wrote at the CBI after the 2015 budget said what would happen if they went ahead with the policy as it stands, and everything that we said has happened. There are fewer apprenticeship starts than there would have been if there hadn't been a reform. And while I get the idea of the balance of who pays for the system matters, my experience, coming back to Sue's point, is British businesses would happily pay a lot more for the skills system through whatever tax mechanism you choose if it worked. And too much of our policy debate on skills has been about let's get some bums on seats doing some form of training, and whether it actually changes anything doesn't matter as much. So it's really about that big tent and getting policy that work. It's not about the concept of paying a levy per se.
Okay. Sue, do you want to tackle quarterly reporting? About the only sensible thing that Donald Trump has ever tweeted was to say that he didn't like the idea of quarterly reporting, I must say. But tell us a bit about the...
Maybe for different reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. And by the way, on the if I can say one sentence on the first question about learning from the third sector. Of course, the fundamental difference is you're born that way to do that job. And that's not true of the overwhelming majority of larger size companies. It's different if you're smaller or a startup. The model I think is fascinating that I would love to see leveraged harder is the B Corp. Because actually, I mean, one of the businesses I'm working with at the moment is Danone, and they are progressively becoming a B Corp across their business sectors in more and more countries. So it can be done, and that requires you to operate and think in a way that is in the direction that you're encouraging us. So to the kind of concrete, this is all very interesting, but how? I think the B Corp is a very interesting how. Quarterly guidance, the principle that Paul set out was very simple, which is actually if you look at the number of operational days in a quarter, it's tiny. And you only, if you're in the ice cream season, which was, X% of our turnover, you only need to get weather like this unseasonally, of which we are going to get a lot more, and your numbers look bad, and it's not a meaningful guide. And so what it really did was it weeded out the people who believed and were empathetic to our operating philosophy from those who were really just looking for us for a very short return. So in fact, it was a very healthy thing to do. I would say the only way in which he was able to do it was by making that announcement in his first week as a CEO, because as he rightly said, no one's going to fire the CEO in their first week. I mean, they might fire him if he actually did something stupid, but if he said something that some people might disagree with, that was slightly different. And actually, it turned out to be a very positive thing for the company, but it wasn't anything like as freeing as you might imagine, because actually what the markets valued was, did we deliver quarterly consensus or not? That's the measure.
Okay, I'm going to come back to this possibly, but I just want to make sure we've covered the questions. One on the far extreme of that wing. Keep your hand up and then we'll bring a mic to you. And then I'll just check if there's one there as well if you want to take a mic. So we'll start here.
Hi, I'm Ben Franklin from the Centre for Progressive Policy, so excuse me for asking a question. And thanks, Professor Mayer, for plugging our research as well, which is great. Interestingly, Capita came bottom of our list, and you mentioned Capita trying to get employee representation on the board. Do you think that will have any positive impacts, and if so, how and why? Thank you.
Okay, and then over here there's a question. Yeah.
Hi, Martha Crawford from the Living Wage Foundation. Thanks also for the plug for Real Living Wage accreditation. I wanted to ask everyone on the panel about the role of business in driving inclusive growth for those they might not directly employ. And Sue talked a little bit about pushing things upstream in supply chains.
Okay, Colin, do you want to pick up on
Yes.
Capita?
So first of all, on the Capita point, there's a very interesting observation in the report that I think we should all pick up. And that is that it observes that Capita comes bottom of the 25 companies in terms of the employee index. And it makes the point that nevertheless, the government is contracting out substantial amounts of procurement to a company that apparently treats its employees so badly. And it makes the very valid point, well, should we not think about the government as potentially being a very powerful agent for change? That is to say, it could base its procurement decisions, its infrastructure allocations, etc., on a variety of criteria which include something beyond just the financial performance of the company. In terms of employee representation, I think and I hope it would make a difference, but it really depends on how it's followed through. It depends on whether or not there is a real commitment in the organization to change the culture. And so there's a risk that these things become symbolic rather than effective. And in that regard, one has to be cautious in just presuming it's going to be a good thing. But if it's part of a general move in that direction of a real commitment, then I think it's to be welcomed. On the question about the supply chain, that is an incredibly important point, and one of the points that one might make about the survey that the CPP has done is it's about employees, not about workers. It's not about people throughout the supply chain, and in particular, people outside of the UK. And in that regard, that's where some of the most serious concerns arise as to how companies are treating people in their supply chain. Now, Unilever did a great deal to try and address that under Paul Poman's leadership. And I've worked a lot with a similar company, the Mars Corporation, which operates all around the world and is trying to do something very similar around the notion of the economics of mutuality. It's hard to do. It's hard to do because you're often operating in hostile environments to the adoption of those types of policies. But to my mind, it is absolutely critically important, and it comes back again to setting the standards. It's critically important that British companies set a standard by which they feel that business is appropriately undertaken all around the world, and that they embed these principles in their supply chains as well as.
Thank you, Colin. We're going to have to wrap up, but Sue, do you have 1 second on perhaps the supply chain points?
Yeah.
You've worked in a business with a huge supply chain.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's really easy as we go into the climate crisis and the decade of disruption that will go with it, to end up with this problem becoming worse, not better. So that's why ideas like the Green New Deal become very important. But I think the critical thing that I want to say is that as businesses look at, particularly businesses that operate at scale, that have a global supply chain, when they look at what's going to happen to their security of supply and their ability to operate in the next 10 years, it's going to be fundamentally affected by the knock-on impacts of climate. And that, as always, will get magnified and crystallised at the very top of the supply chain. So I think that smart companies will understand that the moral case meets the business case here. And those that identify that sweet spot and that are proactive about driving change will do more of the sorts of things that we did at Unilever, because without that, we risk the security of supply at a very fundamental level. So I'm optimistic, not because I think large companies are suddenly going to come over all moral, but because I think this combination of understanding where the risk is going to come from and the fragility of supply and what's going to happen to global supply chains, for those that are more enlightened and are able to look up and out, will really see that that's where the moral and the business case meet.
Right. As the chairman of Natura, the Brazilian company that has a very strong purpose, put it to me recently, you can't do business on a dead planet.
Indeed.
So there is a sort of overall existential self-interest here in getting this right. We've overrun slightly, apologise for that. I hope you'll have time to get to your parallel sessions. But please help me thank the panel for their insights this morning. Thank you.